It began with a look, not the kind that burns instantly, but the kind that lingers quietly in the corner of your memory. The man who walked into the diner that morning looked out of place among the faded booths and humming coffee machines. His suit, though simple, carried a weight of elegance that money alone couldn't buy. His wristwatch gleamed faintly beneath the dim yellow lights, and when he sat down at the counter, every conversation in the room seemed to lower its volume without meaning to. He didn't speak for a while. He just stared into his untouched coffee, as if the dark surface held answers to questions only he knew. When the waitress approached, a woman with tired hands but eyes bright as morning, she smiled at him like she did with everyone else, unguarded and genuine. "Refill?" she asked softly. He looked up then, and for a brief second something in his gaze faltered. "Please," he murmured, voice low, restrained. "Rough morning." You could say that. Her name was Emma Cole, 28, sharp-minded and kind-hearted. She worked 2 jobs to pay for her mother's medication and still managed to treat every stranger like they mattered. He would learn that later. But for now, she was just the woman who poured his coffee and didn't seem to care that his shoes probably cost more than her rent. He didn't introduce himself that day, and she didn't ask. She'd seen enough men in expensive coats to know that some people wanted to leave their world outside for a while. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said, sliding the plate toward him with a warmth that felt almost misplaced in a city that never stopped rushing. Before continuing, subscribe if you believe that love still changes people. Some stories are quiet reminders that it still does. The man's name was Alexander Reed, though few called him by anything other than Mr. Reed, billionaire investor, CEO of Reed Global Holdings, known for his impossible standards and even colder demeanor. But Emma didn't know that. To her, he was just another quiet man with sadness stitched behind his eyes. When she asked what he did for work, he simply replied, "Something that takes too much of my time." She smiled. "Sounds like you need better coffee then." He almost smiled back. Almost. The next morning he returned. Same seat, same order, same silence. By the 3rd morning she teased, "You're becoming a regular, you know." He looked up, caught off guard by her tone. "Is that a bad thing?" "Depends," she said, crossing her arms lightly. "You one of those customers who leave their manners at the door?" He laughed quietly, the sound surprising even him. "No, I try to behave." "Then you're welcome to stay as long as you want." And he did. Day after day, Alexander Reed kept showing up at that diner, wearing the same mask of calm that hid something heavy beneath. To the staff he was polite but distant. To Emma he was curious, an unsolved story she didn't try to fix, but somehow softened anyway. He listened when she spoke about simple things. The rising cost of groceries, her mother's health, the leaky roof she couldn't afford to fix. He never offered money. He never made promises. But one evening, when the last customer left, he said, "You talk about the world like it still deserves saving." She shrugged, drying a glass. "Maybe it does. Or maybe we just have to try so it doesn't stop deserving it." He watched her for a long moment. No one had spoken to him like that in years, without agenda, without knowing who he was. The next day he asked, "Do you ever go out for dinner after your shift?" She looked up, smiling gently but shaking her head. "Sorry, I don't date customers." His chest tightened, not from rejection but from how easily she said it. No calculation, no hidden curiosity, just truth. He nodded, hiding disappointment behind composure. "Then I'll see you here tomorrow." And he meant it. From that day forward, Alexander's world divided itself into 2 halves, the cold, sterile empire he had built and the warmth of that little diner where a waitress who had no idea who he was made him feel human again. In the boardrooms, he was ruthless. At the diner, he became quiet, almost gentle. His assistants whispered about his strange new routine. No one dared question it. But one man noticed, Richard Hale, his oldest friend and business partner. "You disappear every morning before the markets open," Richard remarked one afternoon. "What's her name?" Alexander didn't answer. He only looked out the window, watching rain blur the city skyline. "She's not like the others," he said finally. "And she doesn't know me." Richard frowned. "You're telling me you're letting someone believe you're, what, ordinary?" Alexander nodded. "For the first time, I want to see what's left of me without the company name attached." "You're playing with fire." "Maybe. But it's the first time I've felt something in years." By winter, the diner had become his refuge. Snow fell outside while Emma poured steaming coffee into chipped mugs, humming softly to old tunes on the radio. Sometimes they talked about books. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Silence between them had become its own kind of language. He wanted to tell her who he was, but every time he tried, her words echoed in his mind. I don't date customers. So he stayed her customer. But one night, as he watched her laugh with another man, a delivery driver who brought her free pastries sometimes, something inside him shifted. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was the ache of realizing how much he wanted what money could never buy. A place in her world that wasn't earned through power but through heart. When he left the diner that night, snow still falling, his reflection in the glass window looked unfamiliar. The billionaire who had built an empire was gone, replaced by a man who didn't know what to do with his own feelings. The next morning, he returned earlier than usual, but when Emma saw him waiting by the counter, she smiled and said something that would quietly change everything. What are you really looking for here, Alex? Her voice wasn't suspicious, only sincere, and for the first time, he didn't know how to answer. He'd spent his whole life buying truth. Now he was terrified to give it. Alexander didn't answer right away. The question hung between them, fragile but charged. Emma didn't press. She simply poured him coffee and left the pot nearby, her eyes soft but curious. He admired that, how she gave space instead of demanding it. I don't really know, he said finally, voice lower than usual. Maybe I just like the quiet here. The quiet? She repeated with a faint smile. Most people come here for the noise, to feel less alone. He looked at her then, really looked. At the tired grace in her posture, the way she kept her kindness alive despite exhaustion. There was something magnetic about her calm. It made him wonder how someone who had so little could seem so rich in peace. Her laugh, her patience, even the way she wiped tables, and it wasn't just habit. It was care. And that care was dangerous to a man who had spent years teaching himself not to feel. As he stirred sugar into his coffee, he asked, "Don't you ever get tired of pretending everything's fine?" She raised a brow. "Who says I'm pretending?" He smiled faintly. "Everyone is." Her reply was simple, but it hit deeper than she knew. Maybe, but it's still worth trying to be good, even when life isn't. He stared at her as if she'd just said something forbidden. In his world, goodness was currency. In hers, it was survival. That night he couldn't stop thinking about her. The next morning he cancelled a meeting, something he never did, just to sit in that same diner seat again. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. She didn't know who he was, and he didn't tell her. Every morning, their conversations deepened in quiet layers, books, regrets, music, things both had lost along the way. "Do you believe people can change?" he asked once. She looked up from the register, thoughtful. "Yes, but not because someone else tells them to. Only when they finally want to." He carried those words with him long after leaving the diner, because in his world, he had changed too many people, with fear, with money, with deals that traded souls for signatures. But Emma's kind of change didn't come from control. It came from choice, and that realization unsettled him. She noticed he never smiled easily, that sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence, as if remembering something painful. She wanted to ask what haunted him, but she knew better than to pry. Still, her silence told him she cared, and that alone frightened him more than any business risk ever had. By the 5th month, his visits had become part of the diner's rhythm. The staff began joking about Emma's mystery man. She'd blush, deny it, but deep down she felt something too, an unspoken connection she couldn't define. One evening, as the sky burned orange through the diner windows, he watched her slip a slice of pie into a takeout box. "For your mother?" he guessed. She blinked, surprised. "You remember?" "I remember everything you say," he murmured, almost to himself. She smiled softly. "Then you must have a good memory." "No," he said, "just selective." That night, when she went home, she found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside, there was no name, no address, only money. Enough to pay for months of medication. She froze. Her first instinct wasn't gratitude, it was worry. She knew exactly who might have done it. The next morning, she confronted him the moment he walked in. "Did you do this?" she asked, holding the envelope out. He hesitated. "You needed help." Her tone sharpened. Not in anger, but hurt. "You shouldn't have done that. I didn't mean to offend you." "It's not about offense," she said quietly. "I just don't want charity. Not from you. Not from anyone." He looked at her, conflicted. He wasn't used to people refusing him, especially not kindness. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was just gratitude? For what? For reminding me what decency looks like. Her expression softened then, but only slightly. "Then next time show gratitude with words, not money." He nodded, humbled. I'll remember that. Something changed between them that day. A deeper respect, maybe even trust. She'd drawn a line, and instead of resenting it, he admired her for it. After closing that night, he sat in his car outside the diner, watching her lock the doors. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, tired but radiant under the streetlights. He realized then that he didn't just like her. He needed her presence the way some people need air. But he also knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever, because outside this diner, his face was on magazine covers. His name controlled headlines. And one wrong photograph could destroy everything fragile that existed between them. He told himself he'd reveal it soon, but not yet. Not while her eyes still saw him as someone real. Weeks passed. Winter melted into spring. She began to notice how he looked at her, not with desire, but with something deeper, almost reverent. And though she tried to ignore it, her heart didn't. Then came the morning she didn't show up for her shift. He waited, checking his watch, pretending to read the newspaper. An hour passed. 2. She never missed a day. When the manager mentioned she'd taken the day off to take her mother to the hospital, he stood so quickly that the chair scraped the floor. He didn't think. He just left. By the time he reached the hospital, she was sitting in the waiting room, eyes red, clutching her mother's purse. She looked up, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I heard," he said, out of breath. "Is she all right?" "She will be. They're keeping her overnight." He nodded, relieved, then realized how strange he must look, standing there in silence, not knowing his place. "You shouldn't have come," she said gently. "But thank you. I couldn't stay away," he admitted. Her eyes softened at that, and for the first time she didn't hide the tremor in her voice. "You're kind, Alex, but I still don't date customers." "I know," he said quietly. "Then let me be your friend." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Maybe." Outside the hospital, the night wind carried the faint scent of rain. As he walked away, his phone began to buzz. It was Richard. "Where the hell have you been? The press is looking for you. They found out about the diner." His steps faltered. The fragile world he'd built with her was about to break, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire who owned everything realized he was powerless to protect what truly mattered. By the next morning, the news had already spread across every financial blog and gossip site. Alexander Ward, billionaire CEO of Ward Holdings, spotted visiting a small diner every morning for nearly a year. Photos, headlines, speculation, all twisted into their usual circus. Emma found out before he could tell her. She was cleaning the counter when one of the younger waitresses showed her a headline on her phone. The blood drained from her face. The man she thought she knew, the quiet, thoughtful one who brought books and stayed for hours, was one of the richest men in the country. When he walked through the door that morning, she didn't greet him. Her usual warmth was gone. She simply stood there, eyes steady, towel clenched in her hand. "Emma," he began softly, "I was going to tell you—" "When?" she interrupted. "After I read it online? After everyone else already knew?" He exhaled slowly, his voice low and controlled. "I didn't want this to be how you saw me. Not through a screen, not through headlines." She shook her head. "Then how? By pretending to be someone you're not for almost a year." He stepped closer, his tone breaking for the first time. "I didn't pretend. Not with you. Everything I said, everything I felt, was real." Her voice trembled with emotion. Real would have meant honesty. The silence that followed was heavy. The customers watched quietly from their booths. The manager awkwardly disappeared into the kitchen. It was one of those moments where truth shattered the fragile illusion of safety between two people. He left before she could say anything else. That night, the diner felt colder without him, though Emma would never admit it. The rhythm of pouring coffee, taking orders, and wiping counters couldn't drown the ache of betrayal. At home, she sat beside her mother, who asked gently, "You're not yourself tonight?" Emma smiled weakly. "Just tired, Mum." But her thoughts were spinning. She had believed him, believed the man who listened, who remembered her favorite song, who never once treated her like she was small. And yet the whole time, he was living a life she couldn't even imagine. Meanwhile, Alexander stood at the window of his penthouse, looking out over the city that had once made him feel invincible. Now it only made him feel empty. He poured a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it. His reflection in the glass windows looked hollow, a man surrounded by wealth but starved for something real. Richard entered without knocking. "You should have stayed away from that place. Now every investor's asking why their CEO's been hanging around a waitress." Alexander didn't even turn. "She's not a waitress, she's Emma," Richard scoffed. "She's also the reason we're getting calls from shareholders. You need to manage this before it becomes a scandal. Let them talk, Alexander muttered. Richard frowned. You don't mean that. I do, he said flatly. For the first time in my life, I don't care what they say. There was something raw in his voice, something that even Richard, his oldest friend, hadn't heard before. Days passed before he returned to the diner. When he finally did, Emma wasn't there. The manager told him she'd taken some time off. He left a note instead. No signature, just a few words written in clean, deliberate handwriting. You once told me change comes only when someone finally wants to. You were right. I want to. Emma found the note 2 days later, tucked under the sugar jar she always refilled. She read it twice, then folded it gently into her apron pocket. That night, she sat on her porch, the summer air warm around her. She thought about everything he'd said, everything he hadn't. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she couldn't ignore the way his absence had hollowed something inside her. Her mother noticed. You care for him, she said softly. Emma didn't deny it. I don't know who he really is. Maybe that's what he's trying to find out too, her mother replied, who he is without everything else. The next week, a black car stopped outside the diner after closing hours. The staff had gone home. Only Emma was left counting tips at the counter. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. I know I'm the last person you want to see, he said quietly, standing by the door, but I needed to. She hesitated. Why? Because you were right. I lied. I should have told you the truth, but I didn't, because I didn't want to lose what I had here. You looked at me like I was a man, not a name, and I wasn't ready to give that up. She turned away, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't lose it because of who you are, Alex. You lost it because you weren't honest. He swallowed hard. Then tell me how to make it right. Her eyes met his. Tired, guarded, but still gentle. You can't buy honesty, Alexander. You just live it. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a sentence he already knew he deserved. Then I'll live it, even if it takes a lifetime. When he left that night, she thought it was the end. But the next morning, a delivery truck pulled up outside the diner. The driver handed the manager an envelope and a set of papers. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't money. It was a renovation plan, signed, paid, and approved by Ward Holdings, to rebuild the old diner from the ground up. Emma stood frozen, reading the note attached. For the place that taught me what kindness feels like. She didn't know what to think, whether it was guilt, love, or something in between. But for the first time, she didn't feel anger. She just felt quiet. He didn't show up for days after that, and yet every morning she found small signs he hadn't disappeared completely. A newspaper folded neatly at her favorite booth, a single daisy left on the counter, a receipt with a note on the back that said, "Still learning." Part of her wanted to send him away forever. Another part of her, the part that saw the man beneath the armor, wanted to believe him. But forgiveness isn't instant. It's built. And as the summer sun bled through the diner's windows, Emma realized something she hadn't before. He wasn't the only one changing. She was too. Because somewhere between anger and compassion, between hurt and hope, she'd begun to see that love, real love, wasn't about who someone was. It was about who they were becoming, and she didn't yet know if he deserved that chance. But she knew the story between them wasn't over. Autumn arrived with the sound of rain against the diner's glass windows. The mornings grew quieter, and though the regulars still came for their coffee and pie, something in the air had shifted. Everyone knew what had happened, or at least the version whispered between cups of black coffee. Emma pretended not to hear. She focused on the orders, the plates, the rhythm of work. But every so often her eyes would drift to the booth where he used to sit. It was empty, except for the faint impression of where his hand once rested on the wood. He didn't come for weeks. Not a word, not a call. The renovation plans had been accepted, and the work had begun, but Alexander himself seemed to have vanished from the world she knew. Until one night after closing, she found him standing in the rain. He looked nothing like the man she'd first met. His hair was damp, shirt clinging to his chest, and the usual sharpness in his eyes had been replaced by something almost unrecognizable: humility. "I waited until closing," he said quietly, voice rough from the cold. "Didn't want to scare off your customers." She frowned, but there was no anger left in her voice, only fatigue. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did." He stepped closer. "You said I should live honesty. I'm trying." She crossed her arms, steady but curious. "And how's that going for you?" He gave a small broken laugh. "It's lonely but honest." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to send him away again, but another part, the one that remembered his silence, his letters, his quiet gestures, couldn't. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a notebook. The pages were filled with sketches, notes, handwritten ideas. "I've been coming up with plans for the new diner. I didn't want to change what it was. Just fix what time broke." She flipped through it slowly, the worn booths drawn in detail, the neon sign preserved, the same warm glow of the old lights. At the bottom of one page, in careful handwriting, she read, "A place where people are seen." Her voice softened without her meaning to. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said. "The songs you hummed while closing, the way you always gave the first slice of pie to that old man who couldn't afford much, the stories you told about your mum's garden. I didn't just sit here for coffee, Emma. I came because it was the only place that ever felt like something I didn't have to control." The sincerity in his words disarmed her completely. She looked at him, standing there soaked and trembling, and saw not the billionaire who built empires, but the man who'd spent months trying to learn how to feel again. "Come inside," she said quietly. He blinked, surprised. "You're sure?" "It's raining," she said simply. "And you look like you haven't slept in days." Inside, the diner lights hummed softly. She poured him a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, the way he always drank it. They sat across from each other in silence, the storm outside pressing against the windows. After a moment, she said, "You didn't have to fix the diner." He looked up. "I wasn't fixing the diner." She met his gaze, eyes narrowing slightly. "Then what were you fixing?" "Myself," he said. "But I didn't realize that until you stopped talking to me." For the first time in months, she smiled, just barely, but it was enough. When he left that night, she didn't stop him, but she also didn't feel the same distance she once did. The next few weeks became something unexpected, a rhythm that wasn't romantic but human. He helped with the renovations, not from his office but with his hands. He wore jeans, dirt under his nails, paint on his sleeves. The workers didn't recognize him at first, but even when they did, he didn't act like a man who owned half the city. He laughed when they teased him. He carried wood, wiped sweat from his forehead, shared lunch at the curb, and every day at noon, he'd walk into the diner, sit at the counter, and wait for Emma to bring him coffee. Sometimes they talked, about books, about music, about how he used to believe that control was safety. Other times, they didn't talk at all. They just existed quietly, like two people learning how to breathe again. One afternoon, after the new sign was installed, Emma stepped outside to find him standing in front of it, staring up. "The Silver Spoon," he read aloud. "I never asked, why that name?" She smiled faintly. "Because my mother used to say, you don't need to be born with a silver spoon to serve kindness." He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I've spent my life learning that lesson." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't see the man who'd lied to her. She saw the man who'd changed because of it. That evening they stood side by side, watching the last of the paint dry, the lights from the new sign reflected in the puddles on the ground, shimmering gold against the night. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "the place opens again." "And you'll be there?" she asked. He smiled. "Every day, if you'll have me." She hesitated, eyes tracing the outline of his face. "I told you once I don't date customers." "I remember," he said. "That's why I'll just keep ordering coffee until you change your mind." She laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that caught him off guard. The moment hung between them, suspended, fragile, filled with the kind of unspoken warmth that neither of them dared to name yet. When he turned to leave, she called after him, "Alexander." He stopped. She stepped forward, her voice soft. "For what it's worth, I think honesty looks good on you." He smiled, not the practiced smile of a businessman, but something smaller, realer. "Then I'll keep wearing it." As he walked away into the mist, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. He had already changed, and though her heart was still guarded, it was no longer closed, because love, when it's honest, doesn't demand instant forgiveness. It simply waits, and Alexander Ward was willing to wait. The grand reopening of the Silver Spoon arrived on a bright spring morning, and the air buzzed with a quiet excitement that the small town hadn't felt in years. The neon sign gleamed again above the door, restored to its original glow, a mix of nostalgia and new beginnings. Emma arrived before sunrise wearing the same pale yellow uniform she'd worn since her first shift years ago. She stood behind the counter, running her fingers along the polished wood, remembering the day she'd almost quit, the night she'd almost closed the doors forever, and the stranger who had once sat silently in the corner, watching her with unreadable eyes. By 8 o'clock the diner was full, Laughter returned to the room, the sound of plates, coffee being poured, and forks clinking against porcelain. The workers who'd helped rebuild it had brought their families, and locals filled the booths, whispering that the place felt alive again. And then he walked in. Alexander wore a charcoal grey suit this time, understated but tailored, the kind of elegance that didn't shout but commanded attention anyway. The room seemed to pause. Some recognized him instantly, others just knew from the way he carried himself that he wasn't like the rest. He gave a nod to the staff, a brief, polite smile, and made his way to his usual booth, the one in the corner under the flickering light that Emma had refused to replace because it still had character. Emma approached with her notepad, though she already knew what he'd order. "Black coffee?" He smiled softly. "Still the best in the city." "Quite a compliment," she said, setting the cup down before him, "especially coming from someone who owns 3 cafes downtown." "I only own them," he replied, stirring the coffee absently. "You give this place its soul." She ignored the warmth rising in her chest and turned to leave, but he stopped her gently. "Emma, would you sit with me? Just for a minute." There was something different in his tone. Not the quiet authority of a man used to getting his way, but a careful request, the kind that came from someone afraid of being refused. She hesitated, but finally nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was thick with the hum of voices and the clatter of dishes around them. Finally, he said, "You were right about something." Her eyes flickered toward him. "About what?" "That money doesn't fix loneliness. It just hides it better." She studied him quietly, seeing past the expensive watch and the neatly pressed collar. His eyes, once cold, once calculating, were softer now. "What made you realize that?" she asked. He looked down at the cup in his hands, then up again, meeting her gaze. "The day I left this diner months ago, I went home to a house with more rooms than memories. I sat there waiting for someone to call. No one did." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Emma said nothing. She didn't need to. He continued, voice low. "I built everything I thought would make me untouchable. Wealth, status, control. But it only kept me from feeling human. You didn't ask me for anything. You looked at me like I was just a man, and that terrified me more than anything." She looked away, blinking slowly. "I wasn't trying to change you." "I know," he said. "That's why you did." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she forgot the noise of the diner, the people, everything else. It was just him, the man who once wore his arrogance like armor, now speaking with a vulnerability she never imagined possible. "You don't owe me anything, Alexander," she said softly. "I'm not trying to repay you," he answered. "I just want to earn the right to be in your world." She felt her throat tighten. "And what makes you think I'd let you?" He smiled faintly. "Because you haven't told me to leave yet." Her lips curved in spite of herself. "You're stubborn." He tilted his head slightly. "So are you." For a brief second, they both laughed, the kind of quiet, shared laughter that dissolves tension instead of creating it. Outside, the sunlight spilled through the windows, bathing the diner in gold. The rain that had haunted their first real conversation was long gone, replaced by the warmth of renewal. As the morning went on, he helped serve coffee, wipe tables, even carry boxes out to the back. The staff whispered to one another, astonished to see a billionaire clearing dishes and laughing with the cook. By noon, when the rush died down, Emma stepped outside for air. She leaned against the wall, watching the reflection of the neon sign in the puddles. Alexander joined her a few minutes later, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Peace offering," he said, handing one to her. She accepted it quietly, their fingers brushing. The brief contact sent a spark through her, not dramatic but unmistakably real. He looked out at the horizon, the city skyline barely visible beyond the small-town rooftops. "You know," he said, "I used to think I'd have to leave all this behind one day, that people like me didn't belong here. And now?" He turned to her. "Now I think this is the first place I've ever belonged." Her heart thudded once, sharp and deep. "You say that like you mean it." "I do." His eyes lingered on her. "You taught me that love doesn't start with desire or grand gestures. It starts with respect, with quiet things, coffee at the same table, honesty when it hurts." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was fragile, sacred. Then he added, almost whispering, "If I keep showing up every day, would you ever stop seeing me as a customer?" She laughed softly, eyes shining. "That depends. On what? Whether you're here for the coffee or for me?" He didn't look away. "I think you already know." The sound of traffic and chatter filled the distance between them, but neither moved. For the first time, Emma didn't see him as the billionaire who'd broken trust or built empires. She saw him as a man who'd finally learned what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. And for the first time, Alexander Ward realized that the most valuable thing he'd ever earned couldn't be bought. It had to be deserved. As the sun began to dip, he said quietly, "Tomorrow morning I'll be here again." She smiled, looking down at her cup. "I know." When he walked away, she felt something stir in her chest. Not certainty, but possibility. And for both of them, that was enough. The following weeks passed like slow-burning chapters of a story neither of them dared to define. Alexander came to the Silver Spoon every morning, always at the same time, always to the same booth. He never made grand gestures, never tried to impress her, not anymore. He'd simply sit there, order his coffee, sometimes help with deliveries, sometimes fix a loose hinge or restock napkins when no one asked him to. He didn't talk about his company or his wealth or his past, and Emma didn't ask. She treated him the way she treated everyone else, with quiet respect, a touch of humor, and the kind of warmth that money could never buy. The town began to notice. The staff whispered about the man who had once been a ghost in tailored suits, now laughing with mechanics, old ladies and children who came in for milkshakes. Some didn't believe he was really that Alexander Ward, the billionaire investor whose face had graced financial magazines. Others thought it was a rumor, but those who looked closer could see something undeniable, the way his eyes followed Emma and the way hers softened when he smiled. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset poured through the windows, Emma noticed something she hadn't before. Alexander's suit, though still elegant, was simpler now. The cufflinks were plain silver, the watch gone. There was something different in his presence too, lighter. She set down his cup of coffee and said softly, "You're changing." He looked up, amused. "For better or worse?" "For real," she replied. "You seem less like someone who owns the world, and more like someone who belongs to it." He smiled faintly, stirring his coffee. "Maybe that's because I finally found a place that makes sense." "Funny," she said. "You used to look like a man trying to escape." "I was," he admitted quietly, "but I didn't know what I was running from, or toward." Their eyes met, and in that instant, there was no diner, no background chatter, just the quiet gravity between two people who had spent their lives surviving in opposite worlds. Later that evening, when the last customers left and the neon sign outside hummed faintly, Emma began wiping the tables. Alexander stayed, helping her collect the plates. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied, stacking the dishes. "But I want to." She smiled, shaking her head. "You really don't know how to be a billionaire anymore, do you?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe I never did. Maybe I just knew how to look like one." There was truth in that, one that carried weight. He had spent decades building walls of sophistication and control, only to find peace in the simplicity of a chipped coffee mug and a woman who didn't care who he was. When the clock struck midnight, Emma turned the sign to closed and leaned against the counter. "You're still here," she said. "Do you want me to leave?" She hesitated, folding her arms. "No, but I don't know what you want from me, Alexander." He looked at her, the words catching somewhere between his heart and his pride. "I want to know you, without the roles, not as a waitress, not as a billionaire, just as you." Her expression softened, but her voice was steady. "You can't just erase who you are." "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm just trying to learn who I am without the noise." The silence that followed was heavy, full of everything they weren't saying. Finally, she exhaled. "Then start small." He frowned slightly. "Small," she smiled. "Wash the coffee pot." He blinked, caught off guard, then laughed. It was a deep, unguarded sound that filled the empty diner. "You're serious?" "Completely." So he did. He rolled up his sleeves, filled the sink and began scrubbing under her watchful eye. Water splashed, soap bubbles flew, and for the first time in years, Alexander Ward wasn't the man people feared, envied, or followed. He was just a man, awkwardly trying to clean a coffee pot while a woman smiled at him like he was doing something extraordinary. When he finished, she took the pot from his hands and inspected it. "Not bad," she said. "You missed a spot, though." He leaned closer. "Where?" "Right there," she said, pointing. But he was looking at her, not the pot. The proximity between them shifted something invisible. His hand brushed hers, and for a moment, the world fell completely still. Her breath caught. "Alexander." He stepped back immediately, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry." But she shook her head. "Don't be." Neither said another word after that. When he finally left that night, The bell above the door chimed softly, and Emma stood behind the counter, fingers still trembling. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea of falling for him, or the possibility that she already was. The next morning he didn't come, or the morning after that. Days passed, and his booth sat empty. She told herself it didn't matter, that he'd gone back to his life, to his world, but deep down she felt something missing. The silence he left behind had a shape, one that fit perfectly beside hers. Then, a week later, a letter arrived, folded neatly, no name on the envelope. Inside was a single line, written in his sharp handwriting. Some tests are harder to face than truth itself. Beneath it, one sentence that made her heart stop. "If I come back, will you still see me the same?" She read it 3 times, then tucked it into her apron pocket, close to her heart. Because even though she didn't understand it yet, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something deeper. The day Alexander returned, the rain had been falling since dawn, the kind that softened the edges of the world and made everything shimmer with reflection, the kind that made people feel things they didn't want to. Emma was refilling the napkin holders, pretending not to notice that his booth was still empty, when the door opened and the bell chimed in that familiar tone she had grown to associate with him. She looked up, and there he was, soaked, elegant, but different, not in the way he dressed, but in the way he carried himself. The air around him felt quieter, heavier, as if something had changed inside. "Morning," she said softly, unable to hide her surprise. He smiled faintly. "Is my coffee still the same?" "Only if you haven't changed your order." "Not everything changes," he said, sitting in his booth. "Some things are worth keeping." She brought him the usual, black coffee, no sugar, and set it down carefully. "You disappeared," she said. "I needed to find something," he replied. "Did you?" He looked at her, eyes tired but honest. "Yes, and it scared me." Emma crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "You don't strike me as a man who scares easily." "I wasn't," he said, "until I realized how empty winning had made me, how much noise I'd mistaken for meaning." She stayed silent, watching him. He wasn't performing. There was no arrogance, no charm meant to impress her, just truth, unpolished and heavy. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded check. "For the restaurant," he said. "Repairs, new equipment, whatever you need. I want you to have it." She didn't even glance at the amount. "I can't take that, Alexander." "You can," he said softly. "And you should. Consider it a thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me what decency looks like." Her voice lowered. "I don't want your money." "I know," he said. "That's why I trust you with it." She hesitated, searching his face. "Then what do you want, really?" He took a breath that trembled slightly. "To start again. Not as the man you met. Not as the billionaire who thought he could buy everything. Just as someone who's trying to be better." She sat across from him, the booth's vinyl creaking softly. "And what does starting again look like to you?" He met her gaze, eyes steady. "It looks like this. Coffee with someone who doesn't care about my name. Someone who taught me that silence can mean more than power." There was a long pause between them, the kind that fills with all the words people are afraid to say. Finally, she smiled faintly. "You talk like a man who's lost everything." "Maybe I needed to," he said, "to understand what anything means." Her eyes softened. "You haven't lost everything, you're still here." He smiled just barely. "Only because of you." For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain kept falling outside, washing the world clean. Inside, the smell of coffee and warmth wrapped around them like a fragile peace. When she stood to refill his cup, he reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing hers. "Emma," he murmured. She froze, not because of the touch, but because of the tone. It wasn't commanding, it wasn't cautious, it was human. "I don't want to ruin what this is," he said quietly. "But I can't keep pretending I don't think about you." She looked at him, torn between fear and something deeper. "You shouldn't," she whispered. "We come from different worlds." "I know," he said, "but that never stopped me from wanting something real." "You're a billionaire," she said softly. "You live in skyscrapers and boardrooms. I live here between tips and closing shifts." He shook his head. "I've been in rooms filled with gold and still felt poor." That silenced her. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "What are you asking me for, Alexander?" He hesitated, searching her face for something. Permission, maybe. "A chance," he said simply. "To prove I can be more than what the world turned me into." Her throat tightened. "And if I say no?" He smiled sadly. "Then I'll still come here. I'll still have coffee and listen to your voice and leave before you close. Because even if you never look at me that way, this place, you already gave me more than I ever earned." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her completely. There was no manipulation, no pretense, just a man stripped bare of all his armor. She stood there for a long time, silent, staring at the rain streaking down the window beside him. Then she said almost to herself, "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because some words don't wash away even with time." Their eyes met again, his calm, hers trembling, and something passed between them that both understood and neither could name. He left soon after, leaving his untouched check on the table. She didn't cash it. She couldn't. Instead, she folded it and tucked it under the register, where it stayed for days, maybe weeks, a symbol of something unresolved. Every morning after, he came back, not to talk, not to push, but simply to be near her. Sometimes he read a newspaper, sometimes just stared at his coffee for an hour, and she let him. Until one night, just as she was locking the doors, he appeared again, this time holding something in his hand, a small, crumpled receipt. "What's that?" she asked. He handed it to her. On it, in faded ink, was the message she'd written months ago when she first met him, before she even knew who he was. "Be kind to yourself. The world needs more of that." Her eyes widened. "You kept this?" He nodded. "It reminded me what I'd been missing." Her voice broke slightly. "You can't build a life out of gratitude." He looked at her quietly. "No, but maybe I can build one out of honesty." She didn't respond, but her silence said everything. As he turned to leave, she called out softly, "Alexander." He stopped. She met his gaze and said the words that would stay with him long after that night. "If you want me to believe in you, don't show up with words, show up with actions." He nodded once. "Then I'll come back every day until I prove it." And he did. For the next year, he never missed a morning. Rain or sun, silence or small talk, he was always there. What neither of them knew yet was that time was quietly turning those mornings into something neither had dared hope for, love in its truest form. And soon, the world would test it. By the time autumn painted the city in golden rust, Alexander had become part of the diner's rhythm. The regulars stopped whispering about him. Emma stopped pretending he was just another customer. He never pushed, never crossed a line. He'd sit in his usual booth, sometimes reading, sometimes writing in that small leather notebook he always carried. And when the bell over the door rang, her eyes would lift instinctively, searching for him before she even realized it. One morning, when the first frost kissed the windows, he arrived earlier than usual. He was wearing a navy overcoat, the collar turned up, his hair damp from the cold. Emma smiled when she saw him. "You're early," she said, placing a steaming mug in front of him. He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd come here and steal a bit of peace before the world wakes up." "Peace?" she teased softly. "You come to a diner for peace?" He looked at her, eyes warm. "I come here for you." Her heart skipped, but she didn't show it. Instead, she reached for the sugar dispenser. "You know that's not how this works." "I know," he said quietly. "You made that clear the first day." She smiled, remembering. "I did. But you never told me I couldn't hope." Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened, that quiet tension that only grows when words fall short. He finally spoke again. "Emma, I spent years surrounded by people who smiled because they were paid to. You're the first person who ever told me no without wanting something back." She looked away, her voice gentle. "That's because I didn't know who you were. That's exactly why I came back." He leaned closer, his tone softer now. "You make me feel human again." Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars, footsteps, the faint hum of morning life. But in that booth, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the space between their eyes. She finally whispered, "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because they make people believe in things they shouldn't." "Then maybe," he said, "they need to hear them more." Before she could respond, the door opened and a tall woman stepped in. Expensive coat, polished smile, the kind of presence that shifted the air in the room. She scanned the diner, and her eyes landed on Alexander. "Alex?" she said, surprised. "What on earth are you doing here?" Emma turned slightly, her hands still on the counter. Alexander's face changed, not cold, not cruel, just careful. "Morning, Catherine," he said evenly. "Catherine," Emma repeated quietly under her breath. The name felt sharp. The woman laughed, walking over. "You've been ignoring every message I sent. I had to come see for myself. You're really eating here? Every morning?" Emma felt the sting of that word, here. as if the diner were beneath the world Catherine came from. Alexander's voice was calm. "I like the coffee." "The coffee?" Catherine raised a perfect brow. "You hate diner coffee." He smiled slightly. "People change." Her gaze slid toward Emma, appraising. "And this must be the reason for your sudden transformation." Emma straightened, meeting her look head-on. "Just doing my job." Catherine gave a polite, practiced smile. "Of course you are." Then to Alexander, "Your father's been asking for you. He's worried you're distracted." "I am," he said quietly, "but not in the way he thinks." Catherine sighed. "You can't keep hiding here, Alex. The company, the board, your reputation—" "My reputation," he interrupted, "isn't what I'm trying to protect anymore." That silenced her. She blinked, realizing she'd lost control of the conversation, something that rarely happened to her. After an awkward pause, she leaned in. "You're really letting this be your life now?" He smiled softly. "For the first time, it feels like mine." Catherine shook her head. "You'll regret this. All of it." She turned and left, the bell over the door jangling sharply behind her. When she was gone, silence filled the diner. The few early customers pretended not to listen. Emma wiped the counter, even though it was already clean. Alexander sighed. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "It's fine," she said quietly. "It's none of my business." He watched her, sadness in his eyes. "You always say that, but I wish you'd let it be." Her voice faltered slightly. "I can't, Alexander. I can't be the reason you throw your life away." He frowned. "Throw it away? Emma, that life never felt alive to me." She shook her head. "You think you can escape who you are, but you can't. Men like you belong to another world. And what if I don't want that world anymore? Then it'll come looking for you." He stared at her, searching for a crack in her certainty, but found none. She was stronger than he'd imagined, and that strength was what terrified him most. When the lunch rush began, he quietly stood, placed his payment on the table, and slipped out without another word. That night Emma walked home in the drizzle, her thoughts chasing themselves in circles. She'd seen powerful men before, businessmen, travelers, dreamers who thought kindness was a transaction. But Alexander was different. He didn't just want her attention, he wanted forgiveness. The next morning he didn't show up, or the next. A week passed, then two. By the third, his booth sat empty under the same flickering light that used to catch in his eyes. She told herself she was fine, that people like him came and went, leaving behind empty cups and unspoken things. But when she went to wipe his table one morning, she noticed something tucked beneath the napkin holder, folded paper, heavy with ink. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "You were right. I can't run from my world, but maybe I can change it if I remember you." Below it, his signature, clean, deliberate, like the man himself, and beneath that, a date, 1 year later. "Meet me here, same day, same hour, if you still believe I can be the man you saw in me." Her breath caught. She folded the note back carefully, her eyes stinging with tears. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, and for the first time, she realized that waiting could be its own kind of faith. Winter passed into spring, and with it came the quiet ache of expectation. Every day that year, Emma worked her shift as always. Same smile, same steady hands. But the booth by the window remained a ghost of something she didn't speak about. Sometimes she'd catch herself glancing at it when the morning light hit just right, remembering how his coffee always cooled untouched, while he watched her move through the diner like she carried warmth in her pockets. And when her co-workers noticed, they didn't ask. Everyone had felt it, the kind of love that leaves a silence too sacred to disturb. "Still thinking about him?" asked Nora one afternoon, sliding onto the stool beside her during a lull. Emma gave a soft smile. "No, just thinking about the coffee stains that never come off." Nora looked at her knowingly. "You always look at that table, Em, like you're waiting for someone." "Maybe I am," Emma admitted. Months turned into seasons. The city wore new colors, and Emma's life kept moving, though quietly changed. She was offered a management position at the diner, which she turned down. "I like where I am," she'd said, but the truth was, she didn't want to move from the booth by the window. By the time autumn returned, she had convinced herself it was foolish to expect anything. She told herself he'd forgotten that men like Alexander didn't circle back, not after a year of silence. And yet, every morning, she polished that same table until the chrome shone, until it looked like something waiting for a miracle. The date marked in the letter finally came, a soft, grey morning that carried the chill of early winter. Emma arrived early, though she told herself it was just for inventory. The diner was quiet, Only the hum of the coffee machine filled the space. At exactly 8 a.m., the door opened. The bell jingled once, and she froze. A man stepped inside, tall, his frame sharper than she remembered, as though the year had carved him with purpose. His coat was dark, his suit immaculate, but his eyes, those deep grey eyes, carried something entirely new. He paused at the door, scanning the room. When he saw her, a slow, disbelieving smile crossed his face, the kind that held months of silence, struggle, and hope. Emma's breath caught. "You came. I said I would." His voice was softer than she remembered. "It just took me a while to deserve it." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What happened to you?" He smiled faintly. "Everything that needed to." He took the booth, the same one that had waited for him through every storm. "I walked away from the company. My father called it betrayal. My board called it madness. But I call it starting over." She blinked, struggling to find words. "You gave up everything." "I gave up everything that wasn't real," he said simply. Emma stood there, her hands still trembling. "And what's real now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "This, you, the way you looked at me when I had nothing." Her chest tightened. "You had everything." He shook his head. "Not then. I just had power." It took losing it to find who I was. There was silence again, the kind that hums with unsaid truths. He reached into his coat and pulled out the same leather notebook she'd seen before. "Do you remember this?" She nodded. "I used to write business notes in it," he said, flipping it open. "Now I write about people, about days that meant something." He turned a few pages, then stopped. "This one," he said quietly, "was the first day I met you." He read softly, almost to himself. She didn't smile because she had to. She smiled because she couldn't help it. "I didn't know people still did that." Emma blinked back tears. He set the notebook down and looked at her again. "You told me you don't date customers." She nodded, smiling faintly. "I did." "Then I guess," he said, leaning slightly forward, "I should stop being one." Her heart pounded. "You can't quit being who you are." "Maybe not, but I can change what that means." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "Do you remember this?" She took it, the same napkin she'd once scribbled a thank you note on, the one he'd kept. Her handwriting was faded now, but still visible. "The world needs more kindness, even when no one notices." "I kept this," he said softly, "because it reminded me of the only honest thing anyone ever said to me." She felt the warmth rise behind her eyes. "Why did you come back, Alexander?" He hesitated. "Because every morning I woke up, no matter where I was, Paris, New York, London, I couldn't stop thinking about that diner smell, that light in your eyes, and the sound of your voice when you told me I wasn't special." She laughed through the tears. "You're still not." He smiled. "Then I'm exactly where I should be." The bell rang again, as the door opened behind them. Customers coming in, the morning rush starting. But for that moment, time seemed to pause around them. Alexander reached for the cup of coffee Emma set down, the same way she had 1,000 times before. Their hands brushed, neither pulled away. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, everything they'd both become. He looked up at her, voice barely above a whisper. "So, what's your policy on second chances?" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Depends who's asking." He tilted his head. "A man who learned that money can't buy peace. But maybe love can teach it." Her breath hitched and something inside her, the fear, the distance, the doubt, softened completely. Outside, snow began to fall again, gently dusting the window by their booth. For the first time in years, Alexander smiled without restraint, the kind of smile that didn't belong to a billionaire or a man pretending to be one. It belonged to someone finally home. Emma turned toward the counter to pour another coffee, her heart steady, her lips curved. Behind her, his voice came, quiet, filled with meaning. "Tomorrow?" She looked back, her eyes alive with warmth. Same time. But what neither of them noticed, not yet, was the man in the corner booth reading a newspaper with Alexander's face on the front page. Headline: Alexander Vance steps down, empire sold overnight. He folded the paper, watching them with mild disbelief, then smiled to himself. Outside, the snow kept falling. And somewhere between what was lost and what was found, something entirely new had begun. The snow had already begun to fall again, tracing slow, silent lines down the windows of the diner. It was the same place where everything had started a year ago. The coffee, the quiet smiles, the long looks they both pretended not to notice. But tonight, Everything was different. The lights were dimmer, the air gentler, and the man sitting at the counter no longer wore the armor of a billionaire. Ethan Vale had come alone. No driver, no bodyguards, no tailored arrogance, just a man with tired eyes and a heart that had finally stopped running from itself. He turned the small silver ring in his hand, its surface warm from his touch. It wasn't expensive, not by his standards, but it had meaning that had taken him a full year to understand. Then the door opened, letting in a gust of winter air and a soft chime that pulled him out of his thoughts. Anna stepped in, her hair slightly damp from the snow, her cheeks flushed with the cold. She froze when she saw him, that same blend of surprise and tenderness flickering across her face. "You're back," she said softly, almost afraid her voice might break the moment. He stood, every movement deliberate, uncertain. "I never really left," he answered. "I just needed to find a way to come back as someone you could actually believe in." The last time they had seen each other, he had still been pretending, hiding behind wealth, control, and the illusion that money could replace sincerity. But when she walked away, refusing to be another name in his world of transactions and power, something inside him collapsed. He'd spent months rebuilding everything, not his empire, but himself. She moved closer, her eyes searching his, as if trying to find proof that this wasn't another performance. "Ethan, why did you come back?" He took a deep breath. "Because for the first time I realized the only thing I couldn't buy was peace, and somehow peace looks a lot like you standing in front of me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the old refrigerator, the whisper of snow outside, everything seemed to pause between them. Anna smiled faintly, but her eyes were wet. "I told you before, I don't date customers." He smiled too, that quiet, unguarded kind of smile that she'd never seen before. "Then maybe I should stop being one." He pushed a small envelope across the counter. Inside was a letter, handwritten, simple and honest. It wasn't a contract, not an offer, not even a promise of wealth. It was an apology, a confession, and at the end, just a single line that made her heart tremble. "If love is service, let me serve you for the rest of my life." Anna pressed her lips together, reading the words again and again, the ink slightly smudged by his hand. When she looked back up, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You really mean this?" Ethan nodded. "I mean it more than anything I've ever signed." Her tears came quietly. She walked around the counter slow and hesitant until she was close enough to feel his breath. He didn't move, didn't reach for her. He waited, the same way he'd waited for a year. Every morning, every evening in this same place, hoping she'd still see the man behind the title. Finally, Anna lifted her hand and brushed his cheek with trembling fingers. "You're late," she murmured, half smiling through the tears. He caught her hand gently, holding it against his skin. Worth every second. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the city in silence. The world, for once, felt small enough for both of them to fit inside it. The billionaire who learned how to feel, and the waitress who never stopped believing that kindness was the strongest currency of all. She rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, and whispered, "You can stay, but this time not as a customer." He laughed softly, a sound that felt almost like release. "Then what am I?" Anna looked up, eyes glimmering with warmth. "Someone I can finally trust." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her hair. "That's more than I deserve." "But exactly what you've earned," she replied. For a moment, everything around them seemed to dissolve. The diner, the lights, the snow. It was just two people who had spent their lives running in opposite directions finally standing still. No wealth, no walls, no pretense, just the truth and the quiet miracle of forgiveness. When the clock struck midnight, Ethan slipped the ring into her hand. She didn't say yes, and he didn't ask. They both knew love like this didn't need to be rushed. It had already proven itself, one day at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one lesson at a time. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Vale understood that true wealth wasn't in the things he owned, but in the moment someone looked at him and saw the man beneath it all. As the light flickered and the world outside blurred in gold and blue, she whispered, "I never stopped hoping you'd come back." "I never stopped trying," he said. And when their lips finally met, gentle, human, real, the diner clock kept ticking, but time itself seemed to stop. Because in a city where everything was for sale, they had found the one thing that couldn't be bought. Subscribe if you still believe that love can change even the hardest hearts.